other bloc that could also provide an alternative to these countries, alternative support might be useful. For sure now, and after that, it was not useful definitively. What is the counterfactual in this debate? We think the counterfactual is thus where you will not have such unity between the United States and the European Union and other members of NATO. We think the United States have to achieve or try to achieve lots of its warmongering interventionist stances or skirmishes alone that would have drastically reduced its power and its ability to get political buy-in and also the sheer military might that's required. It would not be able to utilize lots of EU countries as bases and stuff of that sort. Because the European Union and lots of countries within Europe are also different amongst others, but largely are fundamentally different in terms of political stances and intervention stances than the United States, i.e. they don't care as much about the Middle East and so on and so forth. Even now, where they hate Trump and often have called him out, they can't politically oppose him or oppose large military escapades simply because Trump can threaten and has threatened to leave NATO. NATO gave these countries a political platform and a military platform to come together, and has also allowed the United States to dominate these countries. And on a comparative, we think all of that would have happened less, even though some might have happened. We need to look at this as a comparative. First argument, why is this has allowed NATO to dominate the rest of the world, poorer countries like Pakistan and other regional bodies as a body? The first thing I just want to point out is that in NATO, the idea is that the most important clause is that the attack on one is an attack on all. What does this do? This means that they all have to come band together whenever you have any sort of military skirmishes on the borders of any one country, i.e. Turkey. This also means that these countries, especially the United States of America, have large incentives to military empower every single country, to coerce them to spend more in the military infrastructure, because they don't want to give too much military spending to one country or military aid, let's say, in the case of an attack. Because you have to defend all countries insofar as attack, you have a large incentive to ensure that they largely spend on the military expenditure themselves. What is the impact of this, and why couldn't have they dominated otherwise? I think what this means is, due to the clause, you have large-scale military expenditure all across NATO, but also it simply brings them together in this form of political bloc. But lastly, they generally want to keep the perception of NATO to be a strong body, such that it can deter any future attacks, and such that future interventions and attacks and skirmishes can be more successful. Insofar as all of these reasons occur, you're likely to ensure that you actually help any particular country that goes into trouble, or military empower all of these countries to create the strongman image. The impact of this is that you've fundamentally screwed the balance of power that might have existed between somewhat weaker countries like Turkey within NATO against other countries that they have skirmishes in, let's say, Syria. Because now it's not just one country that you're opposing, you're literally opposing all of NATO. What does this do? This allows countries within NATO to literally engage in the policy of brinksmanship, i.e. to warmonger and saber rattle at the point of which they deter any other countries and make them back down. So you don't get any sort of political change that you might have. You don't get any sort of deterrence that you might have. You allow these countries to further amplify their political interests, i.e. intervene further in Syria or stuff of that sort, by further using the NATO name and the NATO military might, and the fact that you will have the United States of America and all these 28 countries coming to your defense to further scare off any countries from any sort of political or military opposition in bowing down to your particular subjugation. Why would this not have happened otherwise? Because now you have a more incentive to increase the military might of other people. You have more international support because NATO has to kind of tend to stick to each other insofar as you have to militarily be on the same page. You're likely to be politically be on the same page as well. And because you have more finances insofar as the United States of America's pools money into other countries' military budgets, and you have general pooling of all of this. The impact of this is that you generally have more skirmishes, more militarization, more bullying of smaller countries, and generally allowing, so in the case of Iraq, in the case of Kosovo, and generally in the case of the war on terror. But the second thing I want to talk about, before that, I'll just take a POI from closing, if there's any. No? Okay.
Move on.
Sure. So within NATO, why has US hegemony gone up, and then by extension in the rest of the world? I just want to note, the United States of America, due to NATO, has a specific reason able to leverage and bully other countries within NATO. That is that they can threaten to leave. And notice, now the dependency, or even after, let's say, the USSR, the dependency has been created. Insofar as most NATO countries are used to this sort of funding and this sort of dependency, this sort of nuclear umbrella that comes, all those sorts of things, this is a leverage that they could use that they cannot use in our side of the house, i.e. they can't threaten to just leave NATO, or threaten not just, which would lead to lots of military funding going away from NATO countries. This allows, and this is the comparative edge that the United States of America has in bullying NATO countries to bending them to their will. Before that, CEO.
All right, so what's the assurance that this aggression is not going to happen regardless, given that America still pursues its militarization and Europe still exists and they still have shared interest in other matters?
All right, so maybe not in the matters they have shared interest in, but like lots of matters they don't have shared interest in, i.e. like how much you should intervene in the Middle East, how much you should nuclearize, stuff of that sort. All of this means the United States now has an additional leverage, i.e. they can threaten to leave. They now have more collective platforms, and they now have an incentive and ability to coerce other countries to just generally militarize more. For all those reasons, that's the comparative harm that we're talking about. But what does this dependency create lead to? Firstly, it coerces NATO countries to spend lots more on their military might, because otherwise, if you don't, we're not going to continue supporting you. We're just going to leave. You have to do some of the burden yourself. This means there's much less money left for economic developments within NATO, especially relatively poorer countries of NATO. But all of this means literally that you have more hostility, more militarization. But lastly, the United States of America is able to use this leverage that I talked to you about to ensure that they coerce NATO countries to come onto their political stances. Whether they're talking about Israel, whether they're talking about the war on terror, which, by the way, EU was not on board with initially, but later on had to get on board with. This leverage ensures that the United States of America can get more political backing in the UN and more political legitimacy. They can get countries that literally can make bases to ensure they have expand their war on terror or any sort of strategic fronts. They get more countries and more money and more weapons and more hostility and lots more allies. This means on a comparative, you are much more likely to pursue drastic harms of the water when lots of people die. Drastic harms of regime changes and drastic harms of more hostility, more militarization, more war. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech and invite the opposition leader to open the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Hold on, sorry, I'll just fix my camera. Oops. Okay. We're gonna start in 3, 2, 1. So the stance from opposition is simple. Number one, we obviously support this the continuation of NATO. But secondly, we have to make clear that this is a historical debate, meaning that a lot of the risks of the time of Eastern European countries who were former Soviet states turning back to Russia and starting to become authoritarian once more, or the increased militarization simply because you could not collectivize as nations as a response to Russia is an inherent risk in and of itself that I don't think open government deals with, and was necessary to deal with, particularly after the Cold War, where there were multiple proxy wars across different parts of the world. The first thing I'm going to do is explain why the more belligerent US that they explain is even worse on their side. Then I'll argue as to why, particularly in the context of post-Cold War Russia, it was important to deter Russian aggression. So number one, what happens to the US on their side? The first thing they note is that the US has historically been massively interventionist, etc. There are multiple reasons they would have done this regardless. A, they did it out of a response for the need of natural resources. It was out of oil that they wanted to invade Iraq, they wanted to invade Afghanistan. B, it was a lot of their response to domestic fears on terrorism that ultimately ensured that their aggression was likely to happen. I would say then they don't prove a compelling mutual distinction to ensure that there was going to be any less American aggression. But here's the thing that's going to win the argument, right? Why is this worse for American aggression? In a world where NATO does not bound America to defend other states, America does not care about the repercussions of their actions in the instance that they anger Russia. I.e., if America angers Russia by entering a state that Russia did not want them to enter into, if Russia attacks another state, it means that America does not have to care because they are not bound by obligation to ensure that they have to protect that state as well. I think it is uniquely NATO that says you have to send troops in the instance that Russia attacks, and your incentives are instead towards things like de-escalation, towards things like wanting to lessen Russian aggression, precisely because you don't want to spend more money to look after states that were going to be particularly hot points of conflict for Russia to be able to enter. And I think you've seen this in places like Syria, where America was willing to back down in instances of Russian aggression. I think we've seen this in multiple conflicts in the Middle East, where America, after Russian aggression, was willing to talk and negotiate with Russian leaders. I don't think that happens without NATO, because if Russia attacks another country and America is not bound to them, they do not care. There's no reason for America to care. Three things done. Firstly, I want to talk about nuclear deterrence, and particularly after the Cold War, where there was a strong nuclear arms race and many close calls, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think the lack of NATO means three things. Number one, it means that Russia, because of their strong nuclear power, has like a lot of power over the countries that were not able to afford the capacity to build up nuclear weapons, etc. That means in periods of negotiation, in trying to convince the leaders to do something, it was the big red button that even if Russia didn't push, the threat of Russia pushing it meant that they could like leverage negotiation, and they could make these small countries follow you out of fear that they might pull out that big red button and cause nuclear warfare. Two, I think it's likely that Western European countries would have also nuclearized, right? And here's the trade-off and the tipping point for that argument. In the instance that you already have America and they're bound to you, in the instance that Russia threatens to like nuke this entire country, it's not likely that you need to nuclearize yourself because America's going to respond and therefore there's like deterrence on both sides. But if Russia nukes another country and America does not have to respond because you don't need to attack these things, therefore it's just not likely that you can trust America and trust Russia to be able to deter each other if it involved countries that are not America or Russia. No thanks. So what that means is, I would say it becomes much harder for the capacity to create global relations because a lot of these Western European countries and a lot of other nations who did not anymore have the capacity to depend on America build their own nuclear weapons. Not only is that bad because a lot of these countries were in post-war recovery, it is bad for the nature of the capacity to build trust in like international relations when anyone can press that big red button and ensure that it is difficult to leverage countries to ensure that they can follow things like democratic standards, human rights, or the capacity to coalesce as different nations. Lastly, I would say the countries most vulnerable, like Eastern European states, would have had an incentive as well to be able to nuclearize. Precisely because they had no other way to be able to deal with Russia. There was no other strong mechanism that they had leverage over it. And I will agree, they were poor, but that's also possible for a lot of poor countries like North Korea to nuclearize as well. The danger here is precisely what OG says. You spend on this long-term nuclear project rather than the incredibly important need to be able to develop your state, particularly after a communist regime that made sure everybody was poor and therefore is difficult. I'll take you at 6, right? So that means then, this nuclear deterrence would have never happened for the countries that mattered the most, non-American countries, and they would have had to take care of it themselves or deal with Russian power. Secondly is that we needed to ensure that Eastern European countries had an opt-out, precisely because of the very strong military presence that Russia had around their borders and the strong militarization that happened during the Cold War. They had two options. It's either they built the military themselves for all the same harms that I said earlier, like needing to prioritize that over important things like development aid, or two, they would have become a Russian proxy state. Because if they didn't have NATO, Russia would just mindlessly enter because the US did not have an obligation to protect them then. I would say then, it is much more dangerous because in these instances, look at all the countries not covered by NATO. Countries like Belarus, where it's very difficult to create development policy because a lot of their economy is tied to the Russian economy, which means they're very oil and commodity dependent and prone to a lot of shocks, which means that they cannot get investment from other nations and therefore are up to a lot of danger. I think NATO was crucial because not only did it mean that you had protection from Russia, it was an active carrot to ensure that people could join that, and they also had incentive to do things like liberalize, which is why NATO was very important to convince a lot of small Eastern authoritarian European countries to ensure that they could start to build democracy, that they could start to liberalize, precisely because they were offered American protection in exchange. I'll take, or yeah? Hello?
I think people were leaving in the room because it had an error.
Oh.
But CG?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the way you characterize the US and their pervasive interests, it doesn't seem that it's a body that you would want to continue post the Cold War. You still need to give analysis why you do not, why you support the continuation of that pervasive nature of the US as you contextualize.
So the US wanted to stop Russian communism from spreading, and I think that's the very reason they built NATO. They also wanted to stop a lot of Russian deterrence. There's no incentive to do that, however, continuously in the instance that they have no obligation to a lot of these other nations. I'd say even if the US is very self-interested, that's a standing incentive. Lastly, I would say the existing aggression of Russia now towards countries like Georgia, towards Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, precisely because they have an incentive to do this. Because the nature of their economy is such that if in the instance the economy turns down because of their massive oil dependence, they have to use their own strongman image to be able to ensure that they can stay in power. That's what Putin's doing right now. I think the only way to stop that is to ensure that A, you have the strongest military forces backing a lot of these weaker and smaller nations, but B, you're forced from different countries that make it political suicide to ensure that if you annex any of these one nations, it is dangerous. I agree it wasn't perfect, but the less countries that you cover as a result of NATO, the more danger that Russia gives all these other nations. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech. And just before we move to the next speaker, perhaps just to flag to speakers that if you'd like to state how you'd like to receive POIs, whether it's in the chat or, you know, by a wave or whatever, you can certainly do so before your speech. So without further ado, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Am I audible? All right, so before I start, I prefer POIs to be either asked in the chat or just open your video and do a wave or anything and I'll just pick you. Just don't speak out loud, all right? That said, I'll just set up my timer. Yeah. All right, let's go. O says a lot of things without like any substantiation at all. I'm going to go over them, like these were quite interesting. So Eastern European countries were turned back to USSR. Really, 3 reasons why not. 1, USSR was broken up, economically destroyed. Their leader like quite literally gave up everything. I don't think they had the ability to take over all of these countries, both militarily or economically. I don't think this happens. But 2, Eastern Europe countries had revolutions all over them, which is to say that authoritarian regimes set by USSR were being taken down all over Eastern Europe. In fact, that happened even before USSR broke down, which is to say that the kind of authoritarian leaders they think would turn back to USSR don't really exist. They've already gone, right? So I don't see why this happens. And third, most importantly, right, even if they're authoritarian and communist regimes like the authoritarian countries in Eastern Europe, why would they turn back to USSR, which is broken, which has been defeated, and not try to, you know, make their own things going? Because even when there were communist regimes in Eastern Europe, they resented that USSR controlled their economy. They resented that USSR was the one they had to report to, that USSR controlled everything. I see no reason for why this happens, especially after a broken up USSR. But second, this idea that USA had their own interest, this is going to more come so when I give some more positive case. But notice the idea is, as SN already told you, that the USA's ability to continue this without allies, without funding, without political support significantly decreases. A lot more on this in a bit, right? 3 more things. 1, USA won't do aggression because they're worried that Russia is going to attack their allies. Bullshit, right? USA is already intervening in North Korea, doesn't give a shit about what happens to South Korea. USA did the war on terror despite everything that happens to its allies. Sure, USA would have worried a lot that if Russia does a lot of aggression to, let's say, its very closest allies, what would have happened? But the idea is, after this, after like USSR broke up, did they really have the ability to do these attacks? But more importantly, did you really need NATO, a military alliance, to be present so that USA cares whether its allies are being attacked or not? The idea and the most important clause is that if your ally or if someone in NATO is attacked, you have to militarily intervene. Do you really need this clause? Does USA really need this clause to worry about Russia attacking its allies? I posit not. They've given no reason for why it should. Last 2 ideas. 1, heavy nuclearization would have happened. Really, economic issues all over Western Europe. They have no money to invest in military. They've been broken down. They would really make nuclear weapons, right? But secondly, that after the nuclear umbrella, the threat of nuclear war increases 10-folds, right? Because now you just don't need like an aggressive actor to press the big red button, which I don't think really happens. I don't think like even the craziest of actors like Kim Jong or anyone just starts pressing nuclear buttons either ways. Like that's absurd. But now that you are under the nuclear umbrella, and even if they get attacked non-nuclear wise, you should have to respond in some nuclear way. The threat of nuclear war just increases many folds in this world. And lastly, NATO did some economic development. Really, NATO doesn't have economic deals with NATO doesn't have economic deals. It's a military alliance. You really need a military alliance for the kind of like economic development O talks about. I posit not. Bullshit, right? I don't think all of the claims had literally any reasons for why they would truly occur. I don't know what they're on about. But now, the biggest attack was that the USA would have done this either ways. 5 reasons why it would not have. First, the biggest partnership they have with the inside NATO is European Union countries. The idea is that European Union without NATO, without this military alliance, is an extremely isolationist area, which is to say they don't really intervene in other political matters unless NATO is involved. Think Middle Eastern crises, think human rights issues in like most of Asia, in the Middle East. They don't really care about human rights or intervening in other political matters unless NATO or military ideas there. Oh, someone's message, please pause. I'm going to be pausing. Someone's message in the chat.
What's the issue? Oh, partner assisting. Okay, just pause the clock, everyone.
All right, yeah. So I paused at 3:32. Is that correct for everyone? Great.
If you, yeah. All right, we'll just give it a second.
Yeah. Also, just so that I'm clear, do you remember the last thing you heard, panel? The last thing I was saying, so I can just pick up from there.
Yep.
Yeah. So what was I saying? Like, what was the last word I said? So I can just pick up from there.
Oh, I didn't have the exact words written down, but I believe it was sub point 1 under the the 5 reasons.
Sure. Sure. Great. Great.
A moment, Ashar, to collect your stuff. So just to, if you want to even, yeah.
Sorry, Jessica. You removed Atlehang and put her in the wrong breakout room. Can you please bring her? The host bring her back to 204? You've put her in 203.
All right, got it.
Okay, thank you.
Can you ask Atlehang to leave the room to go to the main session, and then from the main session, the host will move over here. Room 4,
Yeah,
right?
she's doing that. Yeah, she's doing that right now. She's just going to rename herself to 204. Sorry about that.
All right, no worries.
Waiting on one more per. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. And I'm like, actually, the audience don't even die because when you need, okay, when you need that girl, so she's really possessive. And I'll catch him and say, that girl and everything.
Sorry, who's speaking?
All right, so Albert has moved Atlehang here, so in a second, they will be here.
Sorry, hello. You still keep sending her to the first room to 201. She's supposed to be 204.
No, so 201. Hi, so 201 is the main session. So once she leaves the breakout room to the main session, then Albert will move to this room. So if they are in room 3, ask them to leave the breakout room. They will go to the main session.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we see breakout room 4. Okay, she's in. Thank you.
All right, got it.
Are we good to go then?
Is everyone back? Can we just get a confirmation? Yep.
Everyone from OG is here, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. I know OO's here. CG, is everyone here?
Yes.
Yep. And CO, everyone's here?
Yes, just come here.
Great. All right. So let's kick off again. Whenever you're ready, DPM, we're starting at 3 minutes. And again, you're on the sort of first sub point.
Yeah, sure. I'll just repeat those 5 sub points again. So I'll start in 3, 2. All right. So there's 5. So O claims that USA has interests of its own, something that was also brought in the POI, and they would have also done all of this regardless. 5 reasons why their ability to do all of this regardless is extremely little. 1, the EU is an extremely isolationist place. That is to say that they don't intervene in the politics of other regions unless pressurized by NATO, as we've seen historically, which is to say they don't necessarily care about human rights issues in, let's say, Saudi Arabia, which is why they don't care about the Saudi Arabia-Yemen war as much. They also don't care about other issues in, let's say, North Korea or Vietnam, etc. The only issues that they really care about are ones, especially militarily. They might even intervene economically, but the military impacts only accrue when NATO pressurizes them to do so. Given that they form the bulk of NATO, this is to say that the support that the USA had from these regions would not have accrued. The EU's support is important for 2 sub-reasons. The first is, of course, they give some military benefits and all of those things. But the second more important reason is that they give extreme financial funding to NATO, which means that the ability of USA to continue its war decreases significantly, which is to say that even if USA had its own interests and they would have done skirmishes and whatnot, their ability to make them last longer, come out, succeed, do more damages decreases so significantly. The second reason is that political support. Quite literally, NATO is a huge bloc with mass political capital, because you've got Europe, you've got Australia, you've got all of these countries in a world after the USSR breakup, when you had the United Nations, when sanctions were a really big thing, when everyone's getting sanctioned right and left. Your ability to have this mass political capital to support you in expansionism right after World War II could only have been possible if you had this big a chunk of the world saying, we're fighting the war with you. Because only when they're involved in the war itself would they not vote to, let's say, sanction those countries or vote against the war, right? Which means even your political ability to do so or bully your way through decreases. Thirdly, economic assurity, right? Not just the EU, but also all of these other regional parts which help you make this war, make it significantly cheaper for you. US's presence in Syria is only working because Turkey quite literally is giving it a base to work in, which is to say that the expenses of keeping troops there, of sending them there, training, weapons, all of those things never accrues, right? Which is to say that without such military alliances where these countries are forced to have USA presence, your ability to continue or even wage war in the first place significantly decreases. And lastly, I've lost count at some place, but lastly, this is to say that the kind of support and geographical presence you get is a problem. It's a problem, right? Which is to say that your presence in those areas never really accrues. But notice this idea. The idea is that such regional issues have just become really big now. Why so? Because notice that regional issues right now would have been solved regionally if Turkey, let's say, didn't have quite the backing of half the world behind it to wage wars. This is not just to say that they'll bully these other countries that Essence already talked about, but this is to say that issues become more internationalized. So if USA is backing them on one end right now, in the current status quo in 2020, you see Russia and China intervening, because the issue isn't just regional anymore, it's an international issue with big players funding both sides. The idea is that these wars also continue last war. These wars just become more and more deadly. So the fighting in Syria, Bashar's ability to continue only happens because USA got involved, because Russia now cares about the issue and things just become really, really big. But also, this USA just keeps getting away with horrible stances, right? Why so? US is able to pressurize people on Israel. US is able to get away with bad shit, especially historically. Changes in Dominican Republic, regime changes in Cuba, attempted ones at least, regime changes in Vietnam and Korea and all of those places, because the entire world had to back it at the threat and leverage that USA has. These bad stances USA would not have been able to pursue as easily. Even if opposition had proven all of the things they did, they gave absolutely no reason, but even if they did, look at how many wars happen and how longer they happen and how much deadlier they happen. Does that really compare? I don't think so.
I thank the speaker very much for that speech and invite the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue the case for opening op here.
Hello, sorry, can I be seen and heard? If you're gonna try the POIV, please don't say it out loud. Just say it in chat or make a video. Okay, let's start. 3, 2, 1. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, where are Eastern European countries better off? So let's look at the history of this debate, because you have to look at this motion. It talks about after the dissolution of the USSR, so you can't just put it in today's context. Second issue, where are countries today better off? So this includes the warmongering idea that the previous speaker was talking about. First, where are Eastern European countries better off? So the previous speaker tried to rebut our argument, right? He said Russia had no more influence. A lot of these Eastern European countries hated Russia and therefore would have never sided with Russia or never done anything to side with Russia. Firstly, this isn't true, right? A lot of these countries were incredibly economically reliant on Russia, right? They just left the USSR. They're extremely reliant on Russian oil. They're extremely reliant on Russian investment in Russian industry. So Russia had a huge amount of economic influence in these countries. Secondly, there were still large amounts of political ties, right? So the political blocs that existed during the time of the USSR largely still had lots of allies in a lot of these Eastern European countries, lots of political allies. And or more than this, a lot of the political parties that lived in these Eastern European countries still got their funding from Russia, still got their funding from a lot of these Russian oligarchs and a lot of these Russian groups. So there's still a massive amount of influence that they have in a lot of these countries. Third level of analysis, right? There's still the huge military threat, right? So a lot of these Eastern European countries were impoverished post-USSR because the USSR didn't really invest in them. But Russia, during the time of the Cold War, was spending huge amounts of money in the military, bolstering the amount of people that they had in the military, bolstering their nuclear offensive capabilities, bolstering their air force, and all these things, right? So they had a huge amount of military power that existed during this time post the USSR. What this means is there's still the huge threat that if they go against Russia, if they don't follow the things that Russia's telling them to do, then Russia might invade them. Then there might be more people killed in the conflict. Then they might be deposed as a leader within that country, right? So what that means is there is a huge capability for them to capitulate towards Russia if NATO didn't exist to counterbalance the military influence that Russia had and the significant amounts of influence that Russia had in a lot of these groups. The next thing they said is, a lot of these Eastern European countries actually overthrew their authoritarian leaders that were like supporting Russia. Therefore, they're against Russia. It shows how against they are to Russia. Firstly, they overthrew these authoritarian leaders with the support of NATO, right? The NATO is the one that gave them the military support, the military know-how and the capabilities to be able to overthrow a lot of their leaders. So it's highly likely they wouldn't have been able to do this if NATO was dissolved. Secondly, they did this with knowing that NATO did exist. Why? If they knew that NATO didn't exist to back them up, then it's likely they wouldn't have overthrown their authoritarian leader. It's likely they wouldn't have gone against Russia because they know going against Russia or overthrowing their leader that's pro-Russia might mean that Russia will like use military might to kill them or use military might to overthrow them. It's only knowing that NATO does exist, that NATO will support them in a war, that allowed them to actually overthrow these leaders and give them the incentives that we don't need to be pro-Russia anymore. The United States will support us regardless. Thirdly, what gave them the incentives of these individuals to actually overthrow their leaders? The incentive of these individuals to overthrow their leaders came because of NATO. NATO served as a carrot to a lot of these groups. If you want to join NATO, if you want to join the Western Bloc, if you want to get the Western Bloc support, you need to start liberalizing. You need to start overthrowing your authoritarian leaders. You need to start supporting the United States, right? Without NATO, without this carrot, it's incredibly unlikely that the political will would have existed in these countries to actually overthrow their authoritarian leaders, to actually get rid of them. It's because of this carrot, because of NATO that existed, that allowed them to balance the influence of Russia, allowed them to control a lot of these situations. We think in every layer that they gave to us, we gave them multiple other layers to prove that their layers are wrong. And they didn't respond to a lot of the analysis that the previous speaker gave as to why these Eastern European countries are better on our side. We take that comprehensively. Second issue, where are these countries better off today? Let's respond to the argument that came from the previous speaker, that the US wouldn't have been as warmongering without NATO, and the US is only really bad because of NATO's existence. He said, first he said all these countries are forced to spend more because of NATO. Firstly, this is false, right? Recently, Donald Trump came into power and he brought up the issue that no other NATO country aside from the United States actually follows a NATO military quota, right? This shows you that NATO, even if NATO on paper forces these countries to spend militarily, no other countries actually follow this policy. That's why Donald Trump is so mad about it, right? But more than this, Trump's threats won't actually change anything. Firstly, no other Republicans or Democrats are like pushing this NATO issue forward, right? So it's highly likely that the moment at which like Donald Trump gets goes out of power and another person goes into power, that this will become a non-issue and they won't be pushed to spend more militarily. Secondly, they know that the United States won't leave NATO. So Donald Trump's threats that he's going to leave NATO doesn't actually carry any weight. It's highly unlikely he's going to spend more militarily in a lot of these situations. But let's go deeper. Let's actually go to the analysis, unlike what the previous speaker who just asserted that these people spend more militarily because of NATO. Why don't these countries spend more given that they're part of NATO? It's because they know that the United States will defend them if there's a conflict. They know that the United States is a significant deterrent, that no country will attack them, no country will invade them because they're already part of NATO. This means politically, their incentives are to spend their limited resources and to spend their political capital on other things like education, like social welfare, like all these other things rather than military spending. If they weren't part of NATO, if they didn't know the United States was going to take care of them, then firstly, they would have been scared of Russia. Secondly, they would have been scared of other conflicts and other attacks from other countries. Then it's so much more likely on their side that they would have spent on the military. It's so much more likely on their side that they would have militarized and done much more harmful actions. And so, if their ultimate goal is less military conflict, less harms, and they're trying to stop the military-industrial complex of the United States, it's actually so much worse on their side. Why? If all of these other countries are forced to militarize because the United States no longer backs them, that's when they have their own military-industrial complexes in their own countries. Then France will have their own Lockheed Martin that's lobbying the government to go into wars in the Middle East. Then all these other countries will have their own military-industrial complexes that are lobbying the government to be militarized more and do more conflicts and do more harmful actions. Then these other countries will actually earn money from wars like the United States does now. So it's so much more likely all the other countries on their side will actually go into more conflicts and do much more harm in a lot of these situations. So when the previous speaker said it's not an economic reliance, you don't actually benefit them economically, that's a misread. It was never about NATO being an economic alliance. It's just the fact that NATO exists means that these other countries no longer spend on military and are able to develop themselves. And it leads to significant economic benefits to a lot of these countries. So I'll take the POI right now from OG.
All of the funding in the Cold War period you talked about happened before 1991, before the dissolution of the USSR, before the authoritarian regimes broke out. The debate is happening after that period. How are your harms taking place then?
Okay, so firstly, this isn't true. But secondly, even if you assume that it to be true, we give you two other layers of analysis, right? Firstly, they only did it because they know NATO backed them. Secondly, they only did it because of the carrot that was NATO and the NATO alliance. So the next thing the previous speaker brought up is US would have been less militaristic without NATO, right? But we think this isn't true. Firstly, NATO makes the US look after other countries that they care about. The previous speaker said this clearly isn't true. Just look at North Korea and South Korea. But if you actually look at North Korea and South Korea and you analyze it, the US has constantly not been very aggressive towards North Korea. They've only had verbal threats. They've only had sanctions. And they constantly brought to the negotiating table with North Korea. This exists only because of South Korean government pressure, only because of the existence of NATO and other military alliances the United States has. Without this, US would have no incentive to actually care for these people, no incentive to actually care for these things. Then the next thing they said is the US only has money because of NATO. They only militarize because of NATO. This is untrue. Firstly, the United States gets no money from NATO. So there's no pooling of resources that allows the US to militarize as they say on certain side. Secondly, no other countries are forced to go into conflicts with the United States, right? NATO is a defense treaty, not an offensive treaty. If the United States goes to war in Syria, other countries don't need to go into war in Syria to defend the United States, right? In fact, a lot of other countries actually condemn the United States. The UK and all these European countries condemn the United States in Syria and Yemen. We think a lot of the analysis is based on false premises. We don't think it's true. We think we take this debate on multiple levels. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech and now invite the government member to extend the case for the government bench. Hear, hear.
Okay, no, is my camera on? Okay, let me just put it here so I can see it. So can you guys hear me? Oh yes. Okay, I'll do the countdown. In 3, 2, 1, let's go. NATO's mission has run its course and its necessity is no longer required. We think that the biggest problem from opening opposition in today's debate is that the reason for dissolving NATO is because and the reason why they reject dissolving NATO is because it gives Putin what he wanted for the longest time. We think that the danger with this analysis is that they then themselves argue that member states who are within NATO are also within engagements with Russia, either be economically or be it politically. So they don't show us then how does the US become the ideal response to those issues that exist, especially if you characterize Russia as the evil in today's debate. We think that the US is equally as pervasive and something that they choose not to engage in today's debate, right? So a few issues of debate, because we feel like the framing of this debate was a bit weird in the opening half, right? Because we feel like we need to discuss when do we regret something and when do we regret the continuation of NATO, specifically for this debate. So we're going to distinguish ourselves from opening government in that we're going to show you that we welcome or we regret the continuation of intergovernmental institutions with special emphasis in that it bars security sector reforms from these member states. But secondly, it continues and it exacerbates the dependence that exists on these hegemonic states such as the US. And we think that opening opposition's case is an indicative of that fact that they rely so much on the US to react on these individuals if they even have defense issues. And we think this is something that is problematic and something that is worth regretting in today's debate, right? Two core questions. Firstly, is the continuation of NATO after the dissolution necessary? And we'll show this in our extension. But secondly, just a bit of framing is, when do we regret something and when do we specifically regret this? We say to you that we regret something when it has ultimately reached its objective outcome, right? So we feel like the NATO was initially for collective defense, right? We think that there's no analysis from opening opposition to show that the need of collectivization, especially in defense, especially even when they analyze and argue that Russia is in engagements or entanglements with other member states in other forms that do not even require military defense. But secondly, when it no longer serves its purpose, because we think that we want to show you today that the NATO no longer has a purpose to save. This is why we regret its continuation post the Cold War, especially if we recognize that the initiation of that treaty was about military defense. Okay, let's speak of a few issues of responses before we get to the extension. The first idea is that opening opposition argues that this incentivizes the US to respond, right? We think that firstly, and they argue that it has conditioned the US to always involve and stand against something that is bad. We think this analysis is very dangerous because it assumes that the US best gaze or how they view what is in the best interest of member states or what is the best interest of those states that exist in the era is the correct state. And we think that's very dangerous, and we don't want to paint the US as a better person, right? But secondly, they advance analysis that no, we fight off Russian communism. And to this we ask them, so we fight off Russian communism to the US type of communism, because at the end of the day, you are prioritizing the US's objectives in order to protect these particular member states. We think that there's a lot of analysis that opening opposition has not given us, just rather claims and assertions, right? But secondly, then they speak about this idea that and the analysis that they give is that, okay, we exist in a space where Russia is able to become a dominant force and be able to become problematic in those areas. We tell you that this is highly unlikely by using their own analysis, because these countries also engage with Russia in other forms, right? Forms of economy, forms of political ties, right? We think these ties have proven to the House that then there is no pervasive interest that Russia is proving. If anything, we think that the pervasive interest now is coming from the US, because why are they wanting to continue this alliance when it no longer serves a purpose moving forward, right? The first idea that we want to advance here is why we welcome the discontinuation of intergovernmental institutions, especially when we speak about security, right? We think that security reform is particularly important in debates around intergovernmental institutions. What does this mean, right? It means that we need to be able to employ and empower and improve this sector for countries to be able to defend themselves if met with the crisis, right? We think that one of the objectives of NATO also in its initiation stages was to at least create a collectivized response, right? Because states were existing in ways in times where the military was not as strong enough, or the military was not even existence in those areas, right? The continuation then of NATO suggests that states will never ever be independent and sovereign. Yes, that's the word I'm looking for, in order to respond to a crisis. And we think that we regret it on that first level, right? But the second level that we regret it is on the level of that is it exacerbates the dependence on hegemonic states. And this again goes to how OO has been arguing this debate from a US perspective as opposed to from a NATO perspective, right? Firstly, what are the objective outcomes that NATO has done for its member states post the World War? Two, have they been involved in areas where we thought that this was a decision that was taken by the NATO as opposed to being taken by the US? We think that analysis needs to come from CO. Point OO, I'll take a point.
So if you think the US is so bad, would it be better to have them act aggressively without caring about the repercussions it has to fellow NATO member states?
We think in this debate, we must not speak about the intentions of the US, because we don't know whether they always act in the good or in the bad way, right? But what we know for sure is that they always act in ways to protect themselves. And this is why we think it's particularly dangerous to even view NATO as the US in today's debate. This is why we objectively regret it, and we don't want NATO to continue, for the very same reason that then the US political interests, the US economic interests, the US perceived interest of how the member states are supposed to be protected is what then becomes the conversation within those particular instances, and this is highly regrettable, right? But the last idea that we want to advance in today's debate is that how do we best then manage crisis, right? We tell you from the analysis that we've given, especially around reforming security, the sector of individual states, is that we're able to now put countries, and even countries that exist with engagements of hegemonic states, at a position to be able to engage themselves, to be able to engage themselves when they're faced with a crisis, right? As opposed to a world where then they always have to continuously opt for responding to, seeking assistance from the NATO or seeking assistance from these particular hegemons. So we think that security reform works better when we've removed these intergovernmental organizations that are there to represent everyone. We're profoundly proud to propose this motion must stand. Thank you.
I thank the government member for that speech and invite the opposition member to extend the case for the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me, please? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Then let me get my sheets. Like, give me 10 seconds. So I'll take POIs in my 5th minute, so you can ask it in the chat box or you can ask it softly, and I'll take you if I can. All right. So I begin in 1, 2, 3. From closing opposition, our case is going to be dealt with in 3 phases. First of all, we'll look at the past glory. Second, we'll look at the reformation that has come with NATO. And thirdly, we'll look at future relevance. But panel, we think there is a reason why the UN was set up, even though the UN was set up to deal with the World War which came about, and it was kept for a particular reason, because we necessarily saw that there was a need for us to be able to protect the world so that there is no future occurrence of a 3rd World War. This is because peace is not the absence of war. Peace demands continuous efforts in order to solidify the system. But secondly, there is also a need for us not to whitewash history. We always need to have institutions that remind us of what has happened in the past, which would once serve as a deterrence to aggressors in the future, and secondly, specifically deter the very organizations or the very groups of people that sought to disturb the peace of the world. We think OG's case is premised on the militarization of US, and you have remnants of that in closing. It's premised on the militarization of the US and its allies, and it just lists out the harms of militarization without context. First of all, that is not in the contention is not about the harms that comes with militarization or consolidated armies. What we think GovBench has missed out on is the trade-off that necessarily happens, which I would analyze to you. Secondly, the militarization of America won't stop in their world, neither does the alliance with the West. It means that because they continue to interact in institutions like the UN and on other fronts, they are more likely to still have the support of their armies, even if they build individual armies that protect themselves. Third, the American spreading of military funding between NATO and itself means it is limited in its unilateral agenda of militarization, because it is a concession that we have on upside that Europe is more isolationist. What you then have in their world are 2 things. One, because of EU and their isolation, which has served as a buffer and an insulator, is removed, because it is only in extreme circumstances that they are drawn into war, especially when they feel the effects of it. So the effect you then have in this case is that it increases the US militarization, and hence
all of the US funding goes into its military, where it unilaterally pursues this militarization agenda. It means the harms which they talk about is exacerbated in their world. The assumption from Gulf side is that US values in themselves are not bad, but we agree they are not saints, right? But we think we are willing to stand by some of the values which they stand with. And that's what leads me to touch on CG's case, because the extension does not make sense, because the whole idea is that collective security is not beneficial, and we should seek security reform by enhancing the individual securities of the other nations. The first thing is that when you have a collective security, the incentive for peace is increased, in that there's reduced infighting amongst you because you guys interact on a level of security. Secondly, it means there's more money to spend on development. But I'll not waste time on this because OP has taken that, or OO has taken that, you can give it to them. What you should credit me for is this third point on US interest. One, because now these countries are much more likely to align to democracy, which in itself principally is seen as a value which is superior to that of autocracy. And I beg Gav to challenge this. The second thing is the peace which you necessarily get. Why? Because the US now becomes an ally which protects you from aggressive neighbors. What these guys miss out on is that the countries that sign up to NATO are people who have aggressive neighbors. For example, countries within Eastern Africa who have aggression from Russia specifically, or countries scattered in other areas where they have aggressive neighbors. The trade-off you ignore is that individual armies are likely to encourage wars within themselves. It means that if one country sees that I can take on this other country because of the military might they have is limited, they are likely to go into that war. Therefore, you increase peace on our side because countries are not likely to enter into warring situations when they know that the US is an ally of that specific country. So even though there's a trade-off that the US gets to have an influence and puts its military over there, we think that is way beneficial than the kind of world which Gav gives us in this scenario. But we think, especially from closing opposition, that the dissolution of NATO represents an attempt to whitewash history. And especially given the regard that there is an increased aggression of Russia within Eastern Europe. For example, its annexation of Crimea and its interference in other Eastern African nations. We think rather that the protection which is granted by EU, and even just the mere existence of the EU in itself, serves as a deterrence to Russia. So, like, what alternatives these guys want you to pursue, to say is that we should pursue alternatives like economic sanctions, etc. But we have seen that Russia is not deterred by these. It has continued to build up its military, and sensing the weakness of NATO, it has continued to increase its military spending and increase its aggression within Europe. That is why this agenda must not stop. We must continue to remind them that there is a certain group of people who still exist for values like democracy and the liberation of people and the importance of their human rights. And that is specifically why the UN was created, to stop the wars. But that avenue is not constantly being used because of the interference that necessarily comes from powers like China and from Russia, which dilutes that. What you have within the NATO is a pure agenda, one that is based on democracy and the protection of human freedoms. Yes, I take you from closing.
Okay, so in this debate, you still haven't refuted the fact that then America's interest or the US interest becomes the founding principles of NATO. So you need to respond to that analysis, because even in your speech, we're using the framework of America.
I responded to it in two ways. First of all, if we dissolve NATO, US unilateral interest is not going to go away. But if you have NATO, US has funding for its military, which it continues to spread within NATO. And because it faces strict opposition within NATO from Europe, which likes to be more isolationist, and that's exactly what Trump wants. That's why Trump is seeking to leave, because he wants to pursue a unilateral agenda. The point is that militarization and that influence will not go away. Within the EU, it is diluted to a huge degree by Europe's opposition, right? We think in some circumstances, yes, they are forced to still go to war, but we think that opposition or that insulation that comes gives us a marginal benefit that we don't get at all in your world, right? So we pointed out to Russia's current aggression, the military funding, the dictatorship and sham democracy which they have, the nuclear stockpiling, and the fact that they have oil to continue to fund these wars. This means that most of the time, the countries which exist under that sphere of influence are much more likely to give in. And especially Russia's funding of separatist movements within those countries means that there's constant creation of instability within those regions. We think even if these guys say that, even if these guys say that they are much more incited to go to war because of the presence of NATO, we think that mutually assured distraction that exists is one that is beneficial. Lastly, to the reformation which NATO has brought, right? We think NATO itself has undergone a certain level of evolution. It does not just exist to have an army which necessarily just goes to fight. We think it has heavily been involved in peacekeeping and keeping the peace within most of these nations. These are valid utility that come with NATO, which these guys don't answer for. Because in that instance, private militaries or having your own military within those countries does not deal with the situation at hand. You cannot deal with it necessarily, right? We think also that we erase the division and we have a broader approach of peace, and the defense of states which are terrorized by Russia is achieved. And therefore, we prevent the polarization of Europe in that instance. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that speech, and now invite the government member to conclude the government portion. Here.
Yeah, Butusa, if they can hear.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
It is a little bit jumpy, but I guess we'll have to just do our best.
Okay, let me just sort it out.
Okay, all right, so usually you have to turn off your video so that the audio becomes better.
I might turn mine off as well, just so that less connection issue.
Meeting, okay.
Yeah, because I think it's because we're connected here.
Yeah.
Actually.
Is it fine now?
It's better now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. When states transition from one specific type of governance and move to another type of governance, it means that we ought to ensure that they institute security sector reforms to ensure that they're able to protect the very same citizen. Mfumo gives you an entire analysis on why this motion is about regretting, and it gives you a framework that at any point when an intergovernmental institution has served its purpose, then it's important for us to move into another system where states are able to govern themselves. And this is a justification that he gives to you. The second thing also is that they miss the entire framing. They don't respond to the framing of why we regret something, especially when it does not have any objective or it has served its own objectives. The other thing that they do is that they try to put us in a corner where we have to choose one over the other. And that's not the debate. As an opposition, you ought to justify why you would support a mechanism like this, but we think that they lose this debate because even if we assume the best case scenario where they support this motion, their entire case is contingent on the fact that NATO is the United States. And that's not the case, because even in instances where that was true, we think that they were supposed to justify exactly why those things are important and why they can exist, which ultimately means that we easily kick them out of this debate by simply responding to this specific idea of saying that if you're going to say that United States is an ally and they can protect you, one, they fail to justify how the United States has the best interest of human security, especially that of other countries. They don't spend time justifying why that sort of security is important. The second thing also that we're saying is that we're not saying that international relations are not important. We think it's important for countries to build allies, but in instances where they aren't even able to justify why the institution of NATO is something that's important and why countries should not necessarily remove themselves from NATO and decide that they no longer want to collectivize. The third and the most fundamental thing that they don't respond to is why decentralizing power is something that's largely important, because we think this debate has largely been about hegemonic states. So it means that you ought to justify why having a central power where you have one hegemony, having all the power is something that's significant. And this is is something that they don't justify to you. Mfuma gives you responses, and largely his responses are on the idea that, one, we cannot trust the United States because of like their own pervasive nature. No response whatsoever. The only thing that they say is that the United States has the best interest of those individuals without even justifying why this is something that's true. The best case scenario where we're able to respond and assume that they were able to justify to you how the United States can be like an ally. We think firstly now you need to understand how volatile the state in and of itself is at this particular point, which means that we can't even trust that they have the capacity to offer that militarization, especially in instances where they don't even respond to those things. The principle to the specific idea, and this is largely in response to the idea about the United States being NATO and why those principles and having an ally is something that's important. Panel understands that I respond to the idea that we can't necessarily say that NATO is contingent on the United States, especially as a hegemonic state, because we think that hegemonic states themselves can exercise that amount of power that they have, even when you're saying that we ought to have them as an ally. So we think on a collective base, we can still have those hegemonic states exercising their power. It means that you are not even able to achieve all the benefits that you're talking about. This is in response to closing opposition. So how we easily remove them out of this debate is that we say, firstly, that in instances where they have been able to fulfill its own objectives and now we're moving into a different system of governance, it means that's past the growing response that we're responding to. But secondly, we think that we ought to reform the institutions themselves. And this is why I'm largely going to respond to the idea of security sector reform and why it's important to allow for state to have their own military and protect themselves instead of necessarily always relying on intergovernmental institution to give them that sort of reformation. And I'm also going to justify to you how states have been successful in doing this and largely tying in to what Mfumo told you already in this particular debate. First response. So let's respond to opening opposition. We're going to name their case power dynamics because we think largely their case was contingent on the fact that who's who, which one is best, which hegemonic state should we necessarily take. The first thing that we need to understand when it comes to power dynamics is that now you have hegemonic state existing as a collective. Their basic conclusion here is that when hegemonic state exists as a collective, it means that they can't exercise the amount of power that they have. The powers are always able to balance out. We say for shame. We say, if anything, when hegemonic states exist as a collective, it simply means that they can still try to exert the amount of power that they have. They can still try to fight. It means the United States can still try to fight the principles that, like, for example, Russia has. They can still try to fight the belief systems or policies that Russia wants to implement, which means that in instances where there isn't a consensus on those bases, those hegemonic states can still fight, which means that they can still employ their own military and fight. So the power dynamics do not necessarily cancel each other out when those states exist as a collective. It's even worse when they exist under NATO and when they exist as a collective, because it means that firstly, you're centralizing that amount of power. You're not even allowing smaller states to exist as their own individual entity where they're able to establish their own sovereign and exist and have the power to govern themselves and even implement policies that are best suited for those states or any kind of governing system that is best suited for those states. We think closing government is the only side that gives you the extension and the only side that justifies to you why that sort of reformation can only happen when state exists as sovereign and instead of state existing existing under NATO, and how NATO cannot necessarily protect those states, especially in instances where they accept all the obligations that they have. So the second response also to this fundamental principle is to understand the security sector reform and why this is something that's largely important. This is also our extension, because we're able to justify to you that at any point when a state is able to move from one transition to another, it means that you also even allow them to institute their own security sector reform. What does this look like? Firstly, this looks like allowing even smaller states to have their own military, to even to be able to reform their own military. We understand here that it's not always the case when countries can preempt when a war is likely going to happen, but we think in instances where we don't necessarily rely on NATO to institute those like military bases, it means that you allow for countries to consistently reform their own security sector to ensure that they're able to protect human security. That's the justification that we think it's important, because firstly, we think at any point when you're going to say that this case is contingent on having the United States to protect you, we think in instances where the United States is saying no and they don't want you to protect you, you don't even have any kind of institutions or security sectors to protect you. So this is why we think that this is something that's largely important. The other third thing which we think is largely very important is to respond to this case by saying that the case is contingent on the fact that there's no capacity whatsoever for states to employ their own security sector reform. We say for shame, we say if anything, Russia has been able to form their own security sector. We say even other countries like Ukraine are also even able to form their own security sector to ensure that they're able to defend their own individuals. But before I continue, I'm going to take anyone in opening.
So there's still no response to the massive threat that Russia has posed from both op teams.
So,
How then do we
listen,
think American
with regards to the threat conversation, military threats, we think that military threats can happen internally or even externally from those particular countries. But it still doesn't mean, especially in instances where you fail to justify how the United States can protect those small states from like Russia. We think that you don't provide any analysis whatsoever. Our response to this specific idea is that when countries are able to institute their own security sector reform, it means that it allows them to also even implement their policies to be able to respond to internal and external military threats that happen within those countries themselves. Because it means that when you rely on NATO, you don't even allow those countries to respond for themselves. Panel, the side that wins today's debate is closing government, because firstly, we talked to you about how this debate is about regretting, and all these sides have missed the most important argumentation, which is the framing about regretting this motion. They don't justify to you why we ought to choose the United States as a savior or the messiah to protect smaller states, even in instances where we told you that they have a pervasive nature and they can still be able to exercise their power, even existing as NATO. The second thing is that closing government is the only side that proves to you why intergovernmental institutions are not as important when countries have been able to transition and when they have been able to reach their own objectives. With all those words, I've never been proud to propose.
Thanks very much for that speech. I just note that the POI was out of order, but given the speaker accepted it, we'll just not worry about that. So just everyone just keep an eye on the time. But finally, to conclude, thank the speaker for that speech and invite the opposition whip here. Are you guys having connection issues? Otherwise, I can keep my video off as well. It seemed to help with the connection a little bit. Or are you guys okay?
No, we're okay as CG.
Okay. Ooh.
Am I please audible?
Yes.
Okay, in a moment. All right. Can I kindly request that you give me minutes by minutes update of how my time is being spent, so I can.
I guess we can try, but at the very least, we'll, I'm sure. Yeah, Ufi will do 1, 6, and 7. Yeah.
That would be easiest.
I think 1, 3, 5, and 7 will do.
You can use the timer. I think that would be Googleable, as well as Debate Keeper should help.
Mike, don't worry, I'll do it for you.
Okay.
Sorry, it's just hard to keep track at different times and also track.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So starting 3, 2, 1. So it's important to understand how closing government is the least relevant team in this debate, because they are the team that uniquely presents a very hypothetical case, of which own premise in itself is a gross assumption that dissolve NATO and there will be internal reformations within these countries, and that is very much important to note. The truth of the matter is that the alternative Erasmus gives to you is that even if you dissolve NATO, there is no certainty of proof that these reformations will occur. These countries can just align with the US and not have any reform. And it's as simple as that. So that presumption in itself that they carry out as the best case that they have in this debate in itself is fundamentally flawed, especially when they do not show the high overwhelming certainty of this happening, and we think it does not hold in this debate. Important thing that has been noted in today's debate is that NATO in itself was fundamentally crucial in the post-Cold War in maintaining peace and order that we have seen. NATO has significantly evolved additional functionality to make sure that they are very relevant, something that Erasmus uniquely tells you in today's debate. Now, on the metrics of regret, we think that the call for regret on the side of government is fundamentally flawed on several reasons. One, because to a large extent, NATO has been able to serve the immediate and primary purpose for which it was set up. But we think that it has not caused any worst and terrible outcomes for which we can regret it. But then, even if you still want to regret the continuous existence of NATO on the fact that it has served the primary purpose, we think that its continuous existence does not make it redundant because it is revising to serve additional utility that we wouldn't have had in that particular regard. So closing government tries to do something quite smart, but then at the end of the day, it's very, very flawed. They tell you that, oh, alternatives are not important in today's debate. What Erasmus tells you is that dissolving NATO stands for something. If dissolving NATO, regardless of how bad the US is, if dissolving NATO will create a worse outcome, which wouldn't have existed with the presence of NATO, then we think that you have no grounds to call for the you have no grounds to regret the continuous existence of NATO, because even NATO does not exist, a lot of worse outcomes will come, especially because of US unilateral pursuit of its militarization, and that's important. Fundamental things you hear from Erasmus in today's debate. He tells you that Russia continues to convince a lot of states to align with them in its aim of actually depolarizing Europe in that particular regard. Russia is increasingly resurging in aggression. For example, annexing countries like Crimea, and that's particularly a call of major concern that there should be a checking mechanism for this rising aggression, for a reason why NATO has to be crucially relevant even in the near future. But then again, US alternatives like the United Nations that could ultimately intervene with these kind of things is actually frozen because of a lot of interference that exists within the UN structures, and it's not a proper alternative in checking some of these things. One person can just wake up and veto everything that the UN Security Council wants to do. He tells you again that Russia is funding the creation of separatist movements along its regions, and that is also a major call of concern for which we need NATO. Also, anti-EU sentiments that are hosted by Russia in of itself means that it continues to pursue a polarization of Europe. And even though you can show that US presents some harms and all of those things, we think the presence of US in this particular era of Russia continuously preaching anti-EU agenda means that they are able to prevent a head-on war, and that is also fundamentally important. And those are some of the crucial things Erasmus tells you in this debate that we don't get any absolute concrete response to in this debate. So on the idea that NATO is redundant, we think that amalgamation of security interests in this particular establishment of NATO, as we have seen progressively, is something that stands for something, and we think that they are able to better check on each other. We think Erasmus tells you there is less likelihood of breaking conflicts or even wars within member states. That's a functional utility that you have because of the solidarizing power that NATO brings among these members, and we think is important. But apart from the fact that NATO is also realigning and reforming itself to make itself better. So for example, now you see that the chief of staff of NATO is no longer the United States of America, but then an European Union member. That stands for something. You see NATO now continuing to involve other communist Eastern countries in its programs, for example, the Partnership for Peace. For example, the Partnership for Peace, where they involve communist Eastern Bloc countries. And that shows you that NATO in itself is realigning for a more collective Europe, and that is important in today's debate. So they say that, oh, dependence on hegemonic states does not help. We think this does not matter because you don't get absolute decentralization immediately you break down NATO. Why is this true? Because there is shared powers in the consolidation that we have within NATO, and that does not mutually mean the fact that countries have to look within internal reforms is not mutually exclusive with the existence of NATO, and we don't think that particular argument really makes sense in this debate. We don't think that We don't think that nations are able to view NATO as their primary source of security for which they do not do anything and just look up to NATO. We think that countries have an option to continue internal reforms whilst belonging to the greater solidarity of NATO, and that's important. But then on opening government does something very, very ridiculous in today's debate, because they are the team that shows you that NATO is in itself created to ensure that America becomes a bully all over the place and all of those things, and America cannot be checked because NATO gives them capital and all of those things. But guess what ridiculous opening government does? Opening government shows you that NATO in itself is heavily funded by the other member states in that particular regard. They get political support from these states, and they get geographical reach from these states in that particular regard. When you balance these two arguments, what that tells you is that America in NATO cannot just stand up and do whatever they want, because other countries also have bargain, economic contribution, political power, and validation of these movements, and geographical reach, and all of those means that there is a checking mechanism even on the US actions in of itself. The more reason why Erasmus tells you that US is not likely to independently and isolatedly pursue its aggressive militarization, which we can adequately predict that will be more terrible for a world progressing. We think that is important in this debate. But then they do not show, another problem with opening governments is that they do not show how all of these harms that they say exist because of US dominance in NATO wouldn't have existed if NATO hadn't existed. NATO was dissolved because US could unilaterally do all of these things in that particular regard. We are the team that uniquely proves to you that NATO is progressively relevant.
Thanks very much for that speech. And once again, all speakers, I'm going to now message and ask for them to move the judge panel to the breakout room. And